Yeah, I think because we've been so prepared for Keir Starmer to come in and be Prime Minister, and because kind of, I think everyone has been kind of giving him the questioning that one would expect of Prime Minister. I think it is good to take the moment to go, actually, what has 14 years of Conservative rule done to Britain, and kind of look back over that period to see what has just, I guess, to sort of remember the impact, and not in a way that also means having to uncritically support Keir Starmer, if at all. But it has been one of those of recently of kind of looking, I don't know, I found myself increasingly just looking around the country and going, oh wow, it no longer even feels like the country's going in a slightly different political direction to the one that I would possibly choose. It feels like things have fully just stopped working. So, Sam Knight says, my life divides evenly enough into 3 political eras, but the third political era of my lifetime has been nothing like the previous 2. The period is bisected by the United Kingdom's decision in 2016 to leave the European Union. Covering British politics during this period has been like trying to remember and explain a very convoluted and ultimately boring dream. If you really concentrate, you can recall a lot of the details, but that doesn't lead you any closer to meaning. At some point, I would sort of like to make a Brexit video, because I think the ways in which Brexit kind of broke liberal Britain as well is interesting, right? There was this big moment, I remember, where Parliament was like completely divided on what should happen about Brexit. There's definitely a huge amount of truth to the idea that referenda are this really blunt tool which tends to make opinion on a specific topic so much more divided than it was previously. So you end up with people who previously either had really complex thoughts about the European Union or had no thoughts about the European Union whatsoever, suddenly developing really strong opinions one way or the other, and in some cases like building a whole identity around. And it's been interesting the extent to which that happened for a certain sect of liberal Britons as well. There was this moment after the vote to leave the European Union had happened, and when there was this long period where parliamentarians were trying to decide exactly what the UK's ongoing relationship with the EU would be. You know, would it be just leaving part of the political arrangement? Would it be a complete break? Would there be a trade deal afterwards? And in the votes, there was this potential that we could go for a Norway Plus model. Norway's kind of an interesting part of the EU because it's not a member of the European Union, the kind of political body, but it is part of the European Economic Area. So it's part of what we'll call the single market, so the bit where you can trade across borders like pretty minimally. However, it isn't part of like the Parliament and the like the Commission and all of those additional bits. And there was the potential that the UK could do a similar thing. Like that was one of the options on the table to pursue. And in many ways, that felt like one of the more sensible options, right? Clearly, people had voted to leave the EU, right? Clearly, a majority of people had done that. And it felt like to just not do that at all would have been politically suspect, and I think would have broken a lot of people's trust in politics above and beyond where their trust was already. And yet, the fact that still 48% of people or whatever had said, no, I don't want to leave the EU, like that felt like it would, this felt like a kind of compromise option which took account of both of those factors. But there was enough people in Parliament who were so opposed to leaving the EU that they couldn't support that deal. That I think it flopped massively, the option of going for the Norway Plus model. Then there was a whole bunch of kind of liberal Brits who wanted to push for a second referendum, which for the whole time just, while I understand why people want it, just felt really, felt off. I didn't love it as a way of dealing with the issue, just going, oh, what if we voted again? Like, as much as I would have liked, and I think the country would be in a much better place had we not left, the second referendum campaign felt really insincere because it didn't feel like anyone wanted a second referendum. They wanted to just not have left. FECG saying, I think referenda are good things, then we should have more of them, but only when the options are concrete choices. I don't. I think they're bad. I think the problem is that, as I was saying a moment ago, you go from a position where people might have really diverse thoughts and really complex thoughts about things, or not have much of a thought about them at all. I found like a lot of the Remain stuff was like really weird because it was really overly pro-EU in the fact that like it would refuse any kind of complicated discussion about it as an institution. In 2010, the Conservatives fell short of a majority in the House of Commons and formed, with the Liberal Democrats, Britain's first coalition government in almost 70 years. The state was running a deficit of £157 billion. Under Cameron and Osborne's leadership, austerity was a moral as well as an economic mission. We allowed it to become the defining thing, the former senior advisor reflected. And I mean, that's kind of the core thing that Brexit has, I think, managed to cover over. The decision to pursue austerity at the time at which it was pursued was particularly damaging. We had about 10 years of zero interest rates. So during the 2010s, you see this really low kind of period of interest. So this is for mortgages. So these are like commercially available interest rates on mortgages. And you know, they're sitting around the kind of 3% mark. That's an incredibly low interest rate to be able to borrow money at. Governments can borrow money at much, 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 much lower rates than normal people. If a normal person doesn't pay their mortgage or whatever, right, then a bailiff can come around and take stuff from their house, right? But the amount of stuff they're going to have is of like a limited value. A country is a much bigger thing. Whether a government is investing money by issuing bonds, or whether it is borrowing money via a financial institution of some description, like most people, either people who are buying bonds will accept a lower interest rate because they know that like a country is probably good for paying it back later. There's just like a stability. Worst comes to the worst, they could sell the Queen's crown, right? There's always something. And so the decision to, at that moment when interest rates fell right down to this really low point, as much as the UK did have a deficit already, like this was a moment where sustaining a deficit was kind of a cheap thing to be doing. So it was actually a fantastic opportunity to be investing in infrastructure, physical infrastructure, so rail and roads and that kind of thing, but also sort of metaphorical infrastructure in the sense of education and like the postal service, energy, like all of that kind of stuff, because borrowing money was really cheap at that point. And yet, under the Conservatives, we've spent this period of really low interest rates doing the exact opposite. Where money has been borrowed, it has been during COVID, and it has gone out in all kinds of corrupt ways into contracts for PPE for companies that didn't know how to do PPE and stuff like that. And Brexit has been given over as the sort of like big moment of the Tories' reign, whereas actually just the wasted decade of having this period where interest rates were so low, and yet what we were doing was cutting back and refusing to invest in things and letting both that physical infrastructure and that more metaphorical infrastructure crumble. Like that's the reason why things feel broken. Brexit is part of it, but there are parts of the media that just really love talking about Brexit because unfortunately we find ourselves in the position where this kind of, oh, you can't spend too much money, there is no magic money tree. And that is slightly truer now because interest rates have gone up and therefore it is more expensive if the government did want to borrow money to invest in stuff. But that logic is still so ingrained that it's easier for centrist media figures or politicians to talk about Brexit and to say, you know, oh, we need to keep deficits down, there's no magic money tree, we need to not max out the nation's credit card and all that stuff, because they believe in that logic still.